When the tyrant Alpha King told her she was being sent away for her own protection, his voice carried the heavy weight of a death sentence. But she knew the unvarnished truth. It was execution by isolation. Victor was discarding his queen because, across 5 agonizing years of royal pureblood expectations, her human body had failed to produce a wolf-shifter heir to secure his brutal dominion. The elite palace court had whispered it for months, sneering as the fragile, human sovereign was forced into an unmarked carriage, completely stripped of her crown. They were sending her to a remote sanctuary to heal. The king's lead commander had claimed with a cold, mocking smirk that sent shivers down her spine. The heavy iron carriage doors had slammed shut with a sickening, final thud, locking her away from the only world she had ever known, leaving her in total darkness as the horses galloped away from the capital. But as the carriage wheels sank into the rotting mulch of a forgotten, choking forest, the illusion shattered entirely. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a death trap. The skeletal remains of a crumbling stone manor loomed through the fog, its roof completely caved in, choked by thick, thorny vines that crawled like spiders through the open windows. Decaying wooden beams sagged dangerously under the weight of moss, and the foul stench of stagnant water and mildew hung thick in the freezing air. This was a place meant to break a human soul, a graveyard disguised as an estate, intentionally chosen by the king so the elements would do his dirty work for him. Beside her, Roxy stepped into the damp mud, her fox-shifter ears pinning back as she let out a sharp, heartbroken whimper at the sheer desolation, terrified for her mistress's survival. But Talia, staring straight into the heart of the decay, didn't cry. A strange, simmering heat ignited deep in her chest, and her lips slowly curved into a defiant smile. For the very first time in 5 suffocating years, the king's shadow was gone. She wasn't trapped anymore. She was entirely free. The heavy iron wheels of the carriage ground into the mud one final time before tearing away, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. Talia stood in the center of the overgrown courtyard, letting the damp, freezing mist settle over her skin. Beside her, Roxy dropped 2 heavily worn leather bags onto the damp earth, her shoulders shaking under her simple traveling cloak. As a fox shifter, Roxy's heightened senses were clearly overwhelming her. Her ears twitched frantically against her hair, and her nose wrinkled at the sharp, oppressive stench of stagnant water, wood rot, and ancient mildew hanging over the clearing. The manor before them looked less like an estate and more like a skeletal corpse of stone being slowly digested by the surrounding forest. Huge sections of the outer walls had collapsed into piles of moss-covered rubble, and the grand entryway was choked by thick, thorny briars. Roxy turned around, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and profound sorrow. She whispered that this couldn't be real, insisting that even a human queen deserved a home with a functional roof, and that King Victor had effectively signed their death warrants by sending them to such a godforsaken place. Talia looked up at the gaping holes in the roof, where grand rafters used to be, watching the gray clouds drift lazily across the sky. Then, she let out a soft, genuine laugh that startled a flock of crows from the nearby pines. For 5 years, her ears had been assaulted by the sharp, venomous whispers of noble courtiers, the rigid ticking of palace schedules, and the demanding, booming voice of an alpha king who viewed her body as nothing more than a broken vessel. Here, there were no judgmental eyes, no whispers about her lack of a wolf, and absolutely no matrimonial duties to endure in a cold, loveless bed. Talia told Roxy that the king had intended for this place to be a prison, but he had accidentally given her a sanctuary instead. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't have to perform for anyone. Brushing past the hanging ivy, the 2 women pushed through the sagging front doors to survey the interior. The grand ballroom was completely ruined, the floorboards warped and rotting from years of rain. Realizing they couldn't salvage the main halls before sunset, they searched the lower levels until they found a small, windowless servants' room tucked away near the back of the old scullery. It was small, but the stone walls were mostly intact, offering a meager shield against the biting wind. Roxy shifted slightly into her partial form, using her quick, agile movements to sweep away centuries of dust and cobwebs with the branches she gathered from outside. Together, they dragged in armfuls of dry winter straw and wild ferns from the edge of the woods, piling them high in the corner to construct a makeshift bed. They shared a sparse meal of dried bread, huddled together for warmth beneath Talia's heavy royal traveling cloak. Hours later, the pitch-black darkness of the forest settled completely over the ruined manor. Talia lay awake, staring at the unseen ceiling, listening to the peaceful, rhythmic breathing of Roxy sleeping soundly beside her. The absolute silence was a luxury she had never known. But just as she finally allowed her eyelids to grow heavy, a low, scraping sound vibrated through the stone floorboards. Talia froze, holding her breath. It wasn't the wind. From somewhere deep within the structure, reverberating directly behind the thick wood paneling of the kitchen walls, came a terrifying, hollow moan, thick with agony and completely unexplained. The morning sun offered very little warmth as it broke through the gaping holes of the ruined manor, casting long, fractured shadows across their makeshift straw bed. Talia sat up, rubbing the lingering chill from her arms while the memory of the midnight moan echoed restlessly in her mind. Beside her, Roxy was already awake and preparing for the day. With a fluid, silent grace, the young woman leaned forward, her form blurring for a split second as her human features dissolved into the sleek, auburn coat of a swift forest fox. Roxy offered a reassuring twitch of her tail before darting out through a crack in the rotting foundations, eager to use her heightened predator senses to track down wild game in the dense, overgrown woods. Left alone with the crumbling estate, Talia refused to sit idle. She grabbed a battered woven basket left behind in the scullery and stepped out into the damp courtyard, determined to prove her own worth. Venturing toward the edge of the thick forest, she kept her eyes trained on the damp earth, carefully harvesting wild mushrooms, edible roots, and tart winter berries from the damp soil. As she worked, a familiar, bitter resentment began to burn deep in her chest. For 5 long years at the palace court, she had been looked down upon, dismissed as a fragile, breakable thing simply because she possessed a human heart instead of a beast spirit. King Victor and his elite warriors equated the lack of supernatural shifting abilities with absolute weakness, treating her like a useless ornament that couldn't survive without their suffocating protection. But as she hauled heavy, fallen pine branches back to the manor and successfully patched a gaping hole in the low kitchen thatch roof, Talia felt a fierce wave of pride. Her hands were blistered and her muscles ached, but her human intelligence and sheer resilience were keeping them alive. She was mapping the terrain, building a home, and surviving on her own terms, completely independent of a shifter's brute force. By late afternoon, the gray sky darkened ominously, forcing Talia back inside the shadow-drenched manor. Roxy returned a few moments later, shifting effortlessly back into her human form while proudly presenting 2 plump pheasants she had successfully hunted. Relieved to have a proper meal, the 2 women retreated to the ruined kitchen to prepare the hearth. Talia began washing the gathered mushrooms in a cracked stone basin, the comfortable silence of the room wrapping around them. Then, the air suddenly grew freezing cold. Talia froze, her breath catching in her throat as a sharp, scraping sound echoed through the room. It wasn't an illusion born of the dark night this time. The haunting, hollow moan returned, much louder and deeper than before. The sound vibrated violently through the floorboards, cutting through the quiet evening. Roxy let out a low gasp, her fox ears instantly pinning back against her head in sheer terror as she dropped her hunting knife onto the stone floor. Talia slowly turned her head, her gaze locking onto the ancient, water-stained wooden paneling directly behind the rusted kitchen hearth. The agonized sound was coming directly from inside the walls, as if something trapped in the very bones of the manor was crying out for help. The terrifying sound from the kitchen walls refused to grant Talia any peace, lingering in the dark corners of her mind long after Roxy had finally drifted into a tense, uneasy slumber. Wrapped tightly in her traveling cloak, Talia sat completely still in the pitch-black silence of the servants' quarters, listening to the rhythmic breathing of her companion. She knew that as a human, She lacked the predatory instinct of a shifter, but her mind was sharp, analytical, and entirely awake. Unable to endure the suffocating suspense any longer, she quietly slipped away from the makeshift straw bed, lifting a small, flickering tallow candle to guide her steps back into the shadow-drenched kitchen. The air in the scullery felt freezing cold, thick with the scent of damp stone and old ash. Talia approached the water-stained wooden paneling directly behind the rusted hearth, her fingers tracing the rough, warped grain of the oak. She refused to let fear paralyze her. Systematically, she pressed against the seams of the woodwork, searching for anything that felt unnatural. Her patience rewarded her when her thumb caught on a small, recessed knot in the wood that gave way with a sharp, heavy click. With a low, grinding scrape, a concealed portion of the wall swung slowly inward, revealing a pitch-black cavity yawning into the foundations of the estate. Stepping cautiously inside the hidden chamber, Talia raised her candle, the dim light exposing a small, windowless stone cell. In the corner, sprawled across the dusty floorboards, lay the body of a man. Talia gasped, rushing to his side as she realized he was still barely breathing. He was young, his features sharp but utterly gaunt, completely incapacitated by a horrific affliction. When she peeled back his torn tunic, her breath hitched. Intricate, web-like patterns of midnight black veins pulsed violently across his chest and up his neck, radiating outward from a festering wound near his shoulder. It was Dane, a loyal rebel soldier caught in a deadly crossfire, his body actively fighting against a highly lethal, alchemical poison. Talia recognized the terrifying markings instantly. It was the exact dark sorcery she had seen palace alchemists brew for King Victor to eliminate political dissidents. Before she could even attempt to stabilize the dying man, a sudden, violent crash echoed from the nearby servants' quarters, followed by a muffled, terrified shriek that cut through the silence of the manor. Panic surging through her veins, Talia bolted from the hidden chamber, leaving the paneling slightly ajar as she sprinted back across the warped floorboards of the kitchen. She skidded into the doorway of their small bedroom, the candle flames snuffed out by the sudden movement, but the silvery moonlight pouring through the cracked doorway revealed a nightmare. Roxy was on her knees, her face pale with terror as a massive, heavily armed intruder held a gleaming silver blade tightly against her throat. Two other large, imposing shifters stood flanking them, their dark leather armor smelling heavily of pine and fresh blood, their eyes glowing with an intense, predatory malice in the shadows. Talia froze in the doorway, completely cornered, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized their fragile sanctuary had just been violently shattered. The silver blade pressed deeper into Roxy's throat, drawing a tiny bead of crimson that caught the moonlight. Talia raised her hand slowly, stepping forward with a calm precision that defied the absolute panic roaring through her veins. The massive intruder holding the blade didn't flinch, but the shadows behind him parted, and a towering figure stepped into the center of the cramped room. He moved with the effortless, lethal grace of a dominant apex predator, his broad shoulders easily filling the doorway. His dark leather armor was battle-worn, and as the pale light hit his face, it revealed a ruggedly handsome visage marred by a dangerous, untamed intensity. His piercing eyes locked onto Talia, assessing her lack of a wolf spirit with an immediate, cold curiosity. The intruder barked a demand, asking what a fragile human woman was doing hiding in a cursed ruin, his deep voice vibrating violently through the small room. Talia did not back down. She matched his gaze, letting her royal posture display a dignity the palace had never been able to strip from her. She looked at the distinctive crest carved into his iron bracers, a shattered crown beneath a howling wolf, and the realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. This was Jax, the notorious outlaw alpha who had built an entire underground army to tear down her husband's throne. He was the single most hunted man in the kingdom, a rebel leader King Victor spoke of with absolute, paranoid hatred. Talia told him exactly who she was, her voice steady as she stated that she was the exiled queen, and that this ruin was her domain now. Jax let out a low, dark chuckle, murmuring that a discarded queen was of no use to his rebellion, and ordered his men to drag their dying soldier out of the walls so they could abandon the estate. Panic flared in Talia's chest, but her analytical mind instantly fired. She stepped directly into Jax's path, fiercely warning him that if his men moved Dane even a single inch, the soldier would be dead before they reached the edge of the woods. Jax's eyes narrowed into slits, his internal alpha aura flaring with a suffocating pressure as he demanded to know how a useless human could possibly understand the nature of a warrior's wounds. Talia stood her ground against the crushing weight of his power, drawing upon the sharp intellect that had kept her alive at court. She explained that she recognized the midnight black veins pulsing across Dane's chest, reminding Jax that she had spent 5 years listening to King Victor's head alchemist discuss the dark mechanics of royal poisons. She detailed how the toxin was specifically designed to bind directly to a shifter's circulatory system, using the sudden spike of adrenaline caused by physical movement to rupture the heart from the inside out. Jax stared at her, the absolute silence in the room stretching taut as he weighed her clinical, precise words against his own desperation to save his loyal tracker. Talia confidently met his fierce glare, telling him that her human hands were the only ones capable of neutralizing the alchemical poison, but she would only help if his men lowered their weapons and agreed to stay within the manor walls. Realizing the human queen held all the cards, Jax slowly raised a hand, signaling his warrior to release Roxy. The heavy blade retreated, and the rugged outlaw Alpha stepped agonizingly close to Talia, his breath hot against her skin as he growled that they would stay, but if Dane died, the ruined manor would become her final resting place. The cold stone walls of the servants' quarters became their cell for 2 agonizing days, the heavy oak door blocked from the outside by Jax's ruthless rebel sentries. Talia sat patiently on the makeshift straw bed, refusing to let the confinement break her spirit, while Roxy paced the narrow room, her fox ears twitching at every heavy footstep echoing through the ruined corridors. They were prisoners in their own sanctuary, surrounded by a dangerous underground army that viewed humans as nothing more than fragile liabilities. But Talia knew that raw strength wasn't the only way to shift the balance of power. On the 3rd morning, when a burly guard pushed open the door to slide a meager ration of stale bread across the floorboards, Talia stood up with royal grace and demanded an audience with their commander. She explicitly volunteered their services, stating that she and Roxy could act as dedicated healers to stabilize the remaining wounded soldiers and synthesize an antidote for Dane, proving their strategic value to the pack rather than remaining a drain on their limited resources. Jax arrived a few moments later, his towering presence instantly filling the cramped doorway as his sharp, dark eyes assessed the human queen's unyielding defiance. Impressed by her tactical boldness and desperately needing to keep his dying tracker alive, the rugged outlaw Alpha granted them conditional freedom of movement, warning them that any attempt to flee the estate boundaries would result in immediate execution. With the restrictions lifted, Talia and Roxy threw themselves into treating the sick inside the hidden chamber. The air in the secret room was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the foul stench of decaying tissue. Talia worked meticulously under the dim glow of a tallow candle, using her extensive knowledge of palace alchemy to brew a soothing herbal wash that slowed the spread of the midnight black veins pulsing across Dane's chest. She gently applied damp cloths to the soldier's burning forehead, her movements precise and entirely focused despite the exhausting heat of the enclosed space. Suddenly, a profound wave of dizziness washed over her. Talia reeled backward, dropping a wooden mixing bowl onto the stone floor as a violent, overpowering surge of nausea hit her chest. She gripped the edge of a rotting wooden table, her face draining of all color as she dry-heaved into the shadows, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Roxy rushed to her side instantly, her quick hands supporting Talia's shaking shoulders as the sudden spell slowly passed. The young fox shifter looked intently at her mistress, her amber eyes widening with a sudden, localized realization as she noted the subtle changes in Talia's complexion and the peculiar timing of the illness. Roxy leaned in close, whispering in a low, terrified voice that this wasn't a standard stomach bug or exhaustion from the damp manor air. She counted the months since they had left the capital, planting the first terrifying seed in Talia's mind by suggesting that she might be carrying King Victor's child. Talia froze, her hand instinctively drifting down to touch her stomach as a cold dread settled deep in her veins. The ultimate irony of her exile crashed over her. After 5 years of being branded a barren failure by a tyrannical king, she might finally be pregnant with the royal heir, trapped in a crumbling ruin surrounded by the very rebels sworn to destroy his entire bloodline. 10 days bled into one another, and the crushing silence of the forgotten forest was entirely replaced by the low, continuous hum of a brewing revolution. The crumbling manor morphed into a bustling rebel hub as dozens of hidden warriors arrived under the cover of night, hauling weapons, maps, and stolen imperial supplies through the overgrown gates. Blacksmithing iron echoed from the collapsed stables, while rugged scouts whispered strategies over maps spread across the rotting ballroom tables. Talia's status within the compound had shifted dramatically. She was no longer viewed as a fragile human hostage, but as a vital lifeline. Her successful alchemy had completely stabilized Dane, earning her the quiet respect of the hardened rebel fighters who now nodded politely whenever she passed. Yet, the secret growing within her own body remained a terrifying weight, a truth she guarded fiercely behind a mask of calm composure. Seeking a moment of quiet away from the crowded halls, Talia slipped into the ruined kitchen in the early hours of the morning, intending to wash her face at the stone basin. Instead, she stopped dead in her tracks. Jax was there, slumped over the heavy oak table. The fearsome, untouchable outlaw Alpha was fast asleep, utterly exhausted by the relentless demands of commanding an underground war. In the weak morning light filtering through the thatched roof, his jagged jawline looked softer, the eternal, defensive tension drained from his broad shoulders. For the first time, he didn't look like an imposing apex predator. He looked human, vulnerable, and entirely exposed. Talia looked at him, then down at the cool water filling her palms. A rare spark of mischief ignited within her. Walking over with silent, precise steps, she flicked her wrists, playfully splashing the cold water directly across his sleeping face. Jax bolted upright instantly, a low, ferocious growl tearing from his throat as his alpha instincts flared, his hands flying to his waist to draw a weapon that wasn't there. His piercing eyes locked onto Talia, who stood just out of reach, a composed, mocking smile playing on her lips. Wiped the water from his eyes, his glare narrowed, and he growled that she had a death wish, asking if she treated King Victor with the same level of disrespect. Talia didn't flinch against the weight of his irritation. She leaned against the table, replying smoothly that King Victor never had the courage to look so utterly defenseless, and that a true commander shouldn't let a fragile human catch him off guard. Jax let out a low, rough laugh, the dangerous tension in the room evaporating as quickly as it had formed. He shook his damp hair, murmuring that her tongue was far more lethal than any silver blade his men carried. Talia matched his sharp gaze, countering that in a world ruled by brute force, intelligence was the only weapon that truly mattered. Jax leaned forward, his dark eyes studying her with a newfound intensity that went far deeper than mere curiosity. He admitted that he had expected a broken royal ornament when he found her, but instead discovered a woman who seemed to thrive amidst the ruins. As their banter sharpened in the quiet room, the rigid boundaries between captor and hostage crumbled away entirely, replaced by a subtle, undeniable mutual respect. For the first time, standing in the heart of the decay, they saw each other as absolute equals. The frantic rhythm of the rebel base quieted down as midnight draped the forest in heavy shadows, but the tension simmering within the stone walls remained entirely awake. Talia moved down the darkened corridor toward the makeshift armory, her mind locked on the logistical strain of hiding an entire underground army in a crumbling estate. Pushing past a heavy velvet curtain into the rear washroom, she stopped short, her breath catching slightly. Jax stood near the hearth, his back to her, completely shirtless. In the amber glow of the firelight, his massive, heavily muscled frame looked like a landscape of survival, but what arrested her attention wasn't his raw, alpha power. It was a fresh, horrific gash tearing across his shoulder blade, a jagged, deep wound that was actively weeping dark blood, clearly inflicted by the cruel silver-tipped blades of King Victor's elite palace guards. Jax turned his head, his sharp eyes narrowing as he detected her presence, a defensive growl rumbling low in his chest. Talia didn't retreat. Stepping fully into the room, she bypassed the aggressive stance he usually projected and calmly grabbed a basin of clean water, some clean linen strips, and a jar of healing alchemical salve she had mixed. She told him to sit down, her voice carrying a quiet authority that brooked no argument. Jax stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening, before he let out a rough sigh and sat heavily on a wooden stool, allowing her to approach. As her gentle, human fingers began cleaning the ragged edges of the wound, Talia seized the quiet moment to confront him, asking flatly when his pack planned to move their operations out of her manor. The proximity was intoxicating, the heat radiating from his skin contrasting sharply with the freezing night air. Jax let out a low, grim chuckle, stating that they wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. He explained that this ruin was the perfect blind spot in the kingdom's defenses, a launching pad for his final campaign. His voice dropped to a dangerous, resonant register as he explicitly stated his ultimate dark motive. He wasn't just leading a rogue pack to survive. He was going to march on the capital, tear down the palace gates, and completely dethrone King Victor to end his tyrannical reign forever. Talia applied the soothing salve, her hands steady despite the sheer weight of his confession. She murmured that Victor would unleash hell before surrendering his dominion, warning Jax not to underestimate her husband's cruelty. Jax suddenly reached back, his massive hand gently but firmly locking around her wrist, halting her movements. He turned around to face her, his piercing gaze dropping intentionally to her midsection, his expression shifting into something unreadably intense. He quietly revealed that he knew exactly why she was so terrified of the king's wrath, stating plainly that he could smell the subtle change in her scent, the unmistakable, nascent aroma of a developing pureblood shifter life. He knew she was pregnant. A cold shockwave paralyzed Talia, her heart hammering violently against her ribs as the truth was dragged mercilessly into the light. Hearing it spoken aloud by the outlaw Alpha forced her to completely come to terms with the terrifying reality of her own body. She was carrying the tyrant's heir, completely vulnerable, while standing in the center of a rebel fortress sworn to annihilate that exact royal bloodline. Jax didn't let go of her wrist, but his grip softened, his dark eyes searching hers as he waited to see if the exiled human queen would break, or if she would finally choose a side in the war to come. The freezing morning mist hung low over the damp forest floor, swallowing the ancient, towering pines in a heavy blanket of white. Talia walked with deliberate, quiet steps deep into the woods, heading far beyond the perimeter, where the rebel scouts kept watch. Roxy followed closely at her heels, her agile form tense, her sharp fox ears twitching at every snapping twig. Once they were completely isolated, surrounded only by the quiet hum of nature and the cold mountain air, Talia finally stopped. She turned around to face her loyal companion, the unyielding calm on her face cracking just enough to let the raw vulnerability show. Looking directly into Roxy's anxious eyes, Talia softly confirmed the truth, stating plainly that the seed Jax had sensed was real. She was indeed carrying King Victor's child, pregnant with the royal heir after 5 agonizing years of being mocked as barren by the entire court. Roxy let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as absolute panic flooded her features. Her breath came in frantic, ragged bursts as she whispered that this changed everything, instantly assuming that this miracle meant their ticket out of the ruins. Roxy pleaded with her, insisting that if they sent a secret messenger to the capital with news of the pregnancy, King Victor would immediately recall them, restore Talia's crown, and surround her with the finest protection the palace could offer. To Roxy, the child was a golden shield that could instantly buy back their safety and return them to a life of royal luxury. But Talia's expression hardened into cold, unbreakable stone, and she adamantly refused to even consider it. She reached down, her slender fingers cupping her stomach with a protective intensity that defied her quiet stature. Talia looked deeply at her terrified friend, asking if she had already forgotten the sheer cruelty that ruled the capital. She reminded Roxy that if Victor discovered the child, he wouldn't welcome her back out of love. He would treat her like a locked cage, steal the baby the moment it was born, and systematically mold the innocent child into a ruthless, paranoid monster exactly like himself. Talia refused to let her baby be weaponized by a tyrant who destroyed villages and poisoned his own people for sport. Returning to the palace wasn't salvation, it was handing a fresh soul over to the dark side. Staring out through the dense tree-line toward the crumbling manor, where Jax's underground army was preparing for war, a profound clarity settled over Talia's mind. The ultimate irony of her exile had stripped away her last remaining doubts. Brute force had built Victor's kingdom, but it was going to take a different kind of strength to tear it down. She turned back to Roxy, her voice ringing with absolute conviction as she declared that they would never go back. Jax's rebellion was no longer just a rogue uprising they were forced to endure. It was the only shield her unborn child had against the crown. Looking at the horizon, Talia fully embraced her new reality, deciding with every fiber of her being that the outlaw Alpha's cause was entirely just. She would use her knowledge of the palace to help him conquer the throne, not to reclaim a stolen crown, but to ensure her child grew up in a world free from his father's shadow. The heavy, suffocating tension that had blanketed the crumbling manor for weeks finally broke, replaced by the roaring, golden warmth of a grand celebration. A triumphant supply raid on King Victor's western caravans had filled the estate's storerooms with fresh grain, preserved meats, and casks of rich winter ale, injecting a desperate surge of hope into the rebel army. In the grand, ruined ballroom, bonfires crackled beneath the open sky, casting dancing shadows against the ancient ivy-choked walls. Hardened warriors raised their wooden tankards, singing raw, deep anthems of freedom while the savory scent of roasted meat drifted through the cool night air. For the first time, the broken estate didn't feel like a graveyard. It pulsed with the wild, untamed heartbeat of a kingdom on the precipice of a rebirth. Talia stepped away from the joyous chaos of the main hall, seeking the cool, comforting stillness of the rear corridor. The distant laughter and thumping boots faded into a soft echo as she leaned her head against the damp stone wall, letting out a long, quiet breath. The secret of her pregnancy no longer felt like a localized cage, but a burning beacon of purpose. A heavy, deliberate footstep crunched on the loose gravel behind her. She didn't need to turn around to recognize the intoxicating heat and powerful alpha aura that immediately filled the narrow hallway. Jax stepped into the moonlight filtering through a cracked archway, his rugged features relaxed, a rare, genuine smile softening the fierce intensity of his dark eyes. He held out a cup of spiced cider, his deep voice rumbling as he noted that the guest of honor was hiding from her own admirers, reminding her that his men were currently drinking to the human queen who had saved their finest tracker. Talia took the cup, her fingers brushing against his calloused hand, sending a sudden, electric jolt straight to her core. She looked up at him, matching his intense gaze, and murmured that she merely needed a quiet moment to realize how much this place had changed since the day she was discarded in the mud. Jax stepped closer, his massive frame completely shielding her from the biting wind, his expression shifting into something deeply vulnerable and fiercely protective. He quieted down, his voice dropping to a low whisper as he admitted that his pack had secured enough supplies to establish a new camp deeper in the northern mountains, meaning they could finally leave her manor and give her back the total isolation she had initially craved. A sharp, unexpected pang of panic struck Talia's chest, and before her royal defenses could stop her, she reached out, her small hand locking firmly over the cold iron of his bracer. She looked directly into his eyes, her voice ringing with an emotionally charged honesty as she admitted that she didn't want him to leave. She told him that the silence of this ruin used to be her freedom, but now, a future without him and his rebellion felt like a brand new exile. Jax froze, his breath catching as he processed the fierce weight of her confession. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, his dark eyes searching every line of her face with a profound, unspoken devotion. Talia stood her ground, completely embracing her destiny in that quiet hallway. She wasn't a passive, barren ornament to be hidden away by a tyrant anymore. She was the architect of what was to come. Looking at the outlaw alpha who would protect her child, Talia stepped fully into her true power, pivoting from a discarded, exiled queen into the foundational strategist who would dismantle King Victor's empire piece by piece.